The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling fields. A chill swept through the quiet town, but the heart of it beat steadily in one place, a weathered barn that stood defiantly against the fading light. Inside that barn, a single farmer, Hank Dawson, prepared for a battle that would change everything. He wasn't just fighting for wood and nails, but for a legacy of bloodlines stretching back through generations, grounded in sweat, tears, and love for the land. Hank was a man of the soil, his hands calloused and rough, testament to years of toil. He tended every blade of grass on his property like it was a child, nurturing his crops, training each young calf, and fixing the roof of that barn every time the storms tried to tear it apart. To him, it wasn't just a structure. It was a repository of memories, echoes of laughter and hard work, dreams nurtured under that roof. But that evening, the air crackled with unease, the kind of tingling in your gut that foretells change, often unwelcome. Heavy boots approached, squishing the mud beneath their weight. Hank squinted into the fading light to see four men in dark suits, their faces unreadable. "Mister," one of them called out, his voice slick like oil. Hank straightened. The man stepped forward, the others flanking him like shadows. "You've received an offer for your property. We think it might be in your best interest to—" Hank cut him off, a growl rolling from his throat. "Best interest? You think I'm just gonna sell my home? We're talking about new developments," the man continued, holding up a flashy brochure filled with glossy images of gleaming buildings and expansive parking lots. "A shopping complex, jobs," Hank thundered, his voice rising like a tempest. "I care about what it means to farm, what this place means to my family." The men exchanged glances, sensing that they had ignited something deep within Hank, a fire fueled by not just pride, but the shared struggles of every farmer who ever poured their life into the land. "Mister," he spat, "for a price." A chill swept through the crowd, his anger washing over them like a tidal wave. The wind echoed slightly, whispering promises of resilience. They began to retreat under Hank's fierce gaze, but he knew this wasn't over. The men were just a small front in a much bigger battle. Days turned into weeks, but Hank didn't back down. He spent his mornings tending to his fields, but every evening the men returned. This time they came with documents, flashing dark eyes and tight smiles, offering more money, more promises, and always the same dismissive tone. And each time Hank stood firm, his resolve growing stronger with every refusal. He yelled one day as they laid their papers on the barn's splintered table. "Those shingles up there, my granddad put them there with his own hands. I can still hear him whistling while he worked." They left that night, but Hoover, the youngest of the men, lingered behind. He looked at Hank with a hint of empathy. He didn't want to destroy this man's life, but he was stuck between duty and heart. Hank met his gaze unflinchingly. And fight he did. News of Hank's struggle spread through town. Soon, neighbors gathered, pulling together in unity, a rising tide against a storm. Farmers who had faced their own battles joined him, sharing stories of hardship and resilience, tales of farms lost to relentless encroachment. Each voice added strength to Hank's mission, forging bonds with every shared memory. They organized rallies beneath the very barn that was now a symbol of defiance. The spirit of their fight swelled, turning into something undeniable. On the night of their biggest rally, Hank stood on a makeshift stage. The sea of faces illuminated by flickering lanterns was an army, a family of farmers, townsfolk, and children eager to protect what was rightfully theirs. Hank shouted, his voice penetrating the crisp night air. His words soared like arrows, piercing through the hearts of those gathered. Fear lost ground to hope, and the embers of resistance flared into a roaring fire. Neighbor spoke to neighbor, hands clasped together, igniting passion that would resist the creeping shadows of despair. But the battle was far from over. The development company wasn't giving in easily. Lawyers descended like vultures, armed with legal jargon and aggressive tactics. They filed lawsuits, attacked Hank's character, and tried to divide the community. It was hard, relentless work. Some nights, sleep eluded Hank, worries gnawing at him like a hungry predator. Then one rainy afternoon, they blindsided him with an ultimatum. "Give in, Hank," the lead lawyer said, eyes cold, "or we'll take our case to court." Sitting in the dim light of his kitchen, staring at the table strewn with bills and papers, Hank felt the weight of anguish. Silence hung thick as he contemplated their threat. Doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if he was fighting a losing battle? But as rain pattered against the windows, a memory flickered to life. The barn, sturdy and resilient, had stood through storms that rattled the very foundation. They had weathered blizzards and droughts, laughter and heartache. It was more than wood and nails. It was hope. It was life. And so, standing once more at the heart of that barn, Hank made his choice. "You'll have to tear me down first," he declared, echoing the solid, steadfast walls around him. His neighbors rallied even tighter, fists raising in solidarity as they vowed to join him in the fight. With each passing day, the energy shifted. The corporates underestimated the spirit of a community bound by heart and history. Lawyers cringed under the weight of testimonies delivered by farmers, stories of perseverance that dismantled the cold strategies of their opponents. The community swelled with passion, their resilience a tide that turned against the corporate void. As the court date approached, Hank remained unfazed. He would be a voice for many, the embodiment of a legacy that wasn't rooted in monetary pursuits but the love of the land, the fight to preserve what mattered most. On the monumental day, the courthouse buzzed with energy, the gallery alive with familiar faces. People from all over had come to support Hank, a testament to the ripple effect of one man's refusal to be silenced. As he stood before the judge, Hank felt the weight of generations resting on his shoulders, but within it lay a profound strength. He spoke, his words pouring out with the fierce conviction that had fueled him throughout the fight. "Your Honor, this place isn't just a barn. It's where my family grew, loved, lost, and thrived. It's where a community found a heart." With each word, he forged a connection, igniting the humanity of every listener. It was a story that was deeply woven into the fabric of so many lives. The emotions swelled, creating a collective heartbeat, a reminder of everything at stake. Days passed like treacle, dragging until finally it was over. The gavel dropped, echoing through the silent courtroom. Hank's heart thundered in his chest. In favor of Hank Dawson, the judge pronounced, and the walls seemed to hold their breath. A cheer erupted, a loud, thunderous sound that filled the air, echoing freedom and victory, reverberating out into the hallways and beyond. Hank was enveloped in the embrace of his friends and family, a whirlwind of joy cascading around him. Tears streamed down his face, not just for victory, but for every sacrifice made, every hand that had held fast through this battle. The barn stood taller, stronger in the wake of adversity, their barn. It was more than a structure, it was a legacy, a symbol of unwavering spirit against forces that sought to erase it. Hank knew the fight wasn't over. Protection would be an ongoing battle, but they had won a crucial first round. And step by step, they would forge ahead, writing a future that honored the past, bridging generations with every seed sown into the fertile ground. The laughter rang through the fields, the community bonded together like never before, a testament to the power of their roots standing firm against any storm. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. The familiar scent of fresh hay blended with the earthy aroma of the farm, but that evening, something felt off in the air. Hank Dawson stood at the barn door, heart pounding. He was ready to face the men in suits who threatened to take away everything he owned. A storm was brewing, not just in the weather, but in his very life. The barn loomed behind him, proud and sturdy, its wooden walls whispering stories of laughter and hard work. It had stood for generations, sheltering animals and memories, a place where his father had taught him the art of farming and where Hank had tucked his children into haylofts, reading them stories as the stars blinked above. So when the men arrived with glossy brochures and cold smiles, Hank's heart sank. They had come with an offer he couldn't refuse, or so they thought. "Mister," the lead man called out, his voice smooth as polished granite. Hank crossed his arms, squinting against the setting sun. "What land? My land. Let me explain," the man said, stepping closer, the others flanking him like wolves. "We have plans for a shopping center that will revolutionize this town." Hank's blood boiled. "Progress? You mean profit? You're trying to erase years of history for a strip mall." He could feel the tension swell, could sense the discomfort of the men. They glanced at each other, realizing they had underestimated him. "Mr. Dawson, I'm sure we can work something out," the man pressed, his voice turning oily, desperate. Hank shot back, his voice booming across the field. "This barn is not just wood and nails. It's a part of who I am, who my family is." With that, he slammed the barn door, a sound like thunder echoing through the twilight. That moment defined the battle to come. Hank may have been just one man, but he was ready to fight for every inch against what felt like an unstoppable tide. The days turned into weeks, and each time those men returned, they became more aggressive. They brought contracts and staggering amounts of money, but it never worked. Hank refused to budge. He spent his mornings farming the land, getting lost in the rhythm of tightening his grip on a plow, while his evenings became a cacophony of confrontation. Neighbors began to take notice. At first, they offered polite sympathy. "It's tough, Hank," but soon those whispers turned to murmurs of support. One farmer shouted, clutching a pitchfork as if it were a sword. The town's spirit began to rise. At the annual town meeting, people gathered in the school gymnasium, their voices weaving together one powerful tapestry of resistance. "Hank's right," shouted Margaret, a local schoolteacher, her blue eyes fierce. Amidst the crowd, hope ignited. Families held hands, rallying together for a common cause. Hank realized he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the very soul of their community. As the days marched on, the legal threats grew more daunting. The lawyers representing the developers were sharp, poised, and relentless. They hounded Hank with lawsuits, trying to paint him as stubborn and unreasonable. Words like revenue and development surrounded him like a fog, casting shadows over his resolve. One gray afternoon, the lead lawyer approached Hank directly. "You're making a mistake, Dawson." Hank saw the cynicism in the man's eyes, but he stood tall, his hands trembling at his sides. "You underestimate people who have nothing left to lose." His defiance didn't just impact the lawyer, it charged through the town like wildfire. Neighbors rallied, sending Hank food, raising funds for his legal expenses, and filling his barn with old photos of their farming past. Each gesture reminded him that he wasn't alone. Together, they were a force. Then came the community rally, a watershed moment. Warm Saturday morning, townsfolk gathered around Hank's barn, chanting slogans of defiance. echoed in the air, bringing an electric energy that seemed to wrap around Hank like armor. Hank took the stage, adrenaline surging through him. They think they can divide us. They think they can erase our memories. His heart thundered as he spoke, the words rolling out like drums. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Hank felt the weight of their hope press against him, a force both terrifying and exhilarating. He spoke of the barn, the blood, the sweat, the laughter, and how they would not let it go without a fight. As days turned into weeks, the legal battle escalated. Hank and his crew marched into every court appearance, holding fast against a barrage of tactics. The development company sent in their own crew of charmers and legal guns, ready to bulldoze over this local farmer. But Hank stood strong in the eye of the storm. There were nights when doubt crept into his mind. Could he really hold out? Where was the line between pride and practicality? His children asked him if they would lose the barn, and all he could offer were hugs and half-hearted assurances. The barn is strong. One chilly evening, as rain danced against the roof, he sat in the dim light of his kitchen. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by uncertainty. The telephone rang, cutting through the silence like a sword. It was his old friend Joe, a retired farmer who had faced similar struggles. "Listen, Hank," Joe said, his voice warm but firm. "You've got to remember why that barn matters. It's more than just a building. It's legacy, family, stand by your guns." Those words ignited something deep within Hank. He reached for his old hat, the one his dad wore, and felt an unyielding force surge through him. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all those years, all that history waiting to be honored. The court date arrived, a culmination of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt and clarity. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation, townspeople anxiously waiting to hear the verdict. Hank stood at the entrance, looking at the worn stone facade, recalling all the hands that had built a life around this barn. As he stepped into the courtroom, he walked into an arena that felt both foreign and sacred. The judge's gavel was a battle cry resonating deep within him. He could feel the stares from acquaintances, all willing future fighters, waiting for the coordinates of his confrontation against the tide. The lawyer for the developers stood tall, a titan in a tailored suit. "Your Honor, the facts are clear. This land is prime real estate, producing little revenue for the town." Hank felt a fire roaring in his belly. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it all in his mind. When it was his turn, he took a deep breath, steadying himself against the roar of the world outside. "Your Honor, this land is not just property." He spoke not just of the barn, but of everything it represented. The summers spent in the fields, the harvest celebrations, the stories shared under its roof. With each word, he rooted himself further into the ground, entwined with the lives that came before him. The crowd seemed to lean in, their collective breath holding in suspense. He looked into their faces, felt the strength of their presence. "I am not just fighting for timber and nails. I am fighting for the very soul of our community." "Not be silenced." The words hung in the dry air, powerful and unyielding. As he finished speaking, a ripple of energy passed through the crowd, a surge of support that softened the corners of Hank's resolve. Moments later, the judge deliberated, his gavel falling once more like thunder. "In favor of Hank Dawson," he announced, and the air erupted with celebration. Cheers rang out, echoing through the hall. Friends rushed to embrace Hank, sharing a love and relief that wrapped around them like a cozy blanket. The barn, precariously perched on the edge of existence, now thrummed with life around them. It was theirs, held aloft by the spirit of every neighbor who had stepped forward, united by the unconditional love for their place in the world. And just like that, with the power of persistence and community, victory was snatched from the jaws of despair. Hank had fought like hell, but ultimately it was their collective strength that carved out a new legacy, one looking to the future while remaining firmly rooted in history. As the sun set, bathing the barn in hues of gold, Hank stepped back far enough to look at the structure that had brought people together. It stood proud, a testament to the fights waged and won, a reminder of what it meant to stand firm against any storm. Together, they had forged a story that would be whispered through future generations, honored and remembered under the same barn roof. And they knew they would keep fighting as long as they had each other. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty fields, a vibrant orange and red glow wrapping around the barn like a warm embrace. On this particular day, a storm brewed not in the sky, but right at the heart of Hank Dawson's life, the sort of storm that churns in your stomach and sends shivers down your spine. Hank stood at the barn door, heart racing, as three men in dark suits approached, their footsteps crunching the gravel. "Mister," the tallest one called, a fake smile plastered on his face, all charm and no warmth. Hank's brows furrowed, fingers tightening around the barn's wooden frame. About what? The man stepped closer, the others hovering like vultures behind him. "We're here with an offer for your property. A generous offer, really. Think of all the jobs this development will create: a shopping center, restaurants." Hank felt a fire ignite within him. "Generous? You mean you're trying to take away my home?" The man shrugged, fumbling through a brochure like it held the key to Hank's resolve. "It's about moving forward. Progress, Mr. Dawson. Progress." That word ricocheted in Hank's mind, heavy and laden with implications. He took a deep breath, letting the smell of fresh hay ground him. This barn, this land, means more than you'll ever understand. It's where my father worked and where I've raised my kids. You want to bulldoze it for a parking lot." The men exchanged glances, their confidence waning like the sinking sun. They were used to easy victories, not to the fire of a man standing in front of something he loved fiercely. "Think it over, Hank. We'll be back," the lead man said, his voice dull and defeated. As they walked away, Hank slammed the door of the barn behind him, the sound reverberating like thunder. He stood still for a moment, letting adrenaline wash over him. This wasn't just a barn. It held years of memories, echoes of laughter, history embedded within its timber walls. He felt an unshakable urge coursing through him. Fight. Days turned into weeks, and each time the men returned, they brought more pressure, more threats masked in shiny deals. But Hank would have none of it. Each night, after a long day of tending to the crops, he found himself on the front porch with a cup of coffee, staring out into the fields that stretched as far as he could see. He could almost hear his father's voice, "You fight for what's yours, son." So he planted his feet firmly, rooted in the rich soil that had nourished his family for generations. Even as the suits persisted, men who seemed oblivious to the life growing all around them, Hank's resolve solidified. One afternoon, after finishing repairs on the barn's roof, he looked out over the property and saw smoke spiraling into the sky. He dashed toward the source, heart pounding, to find neighbors gathered, murmuring anxiously. People had come together, drawn by the same unease that had started to flicker in Hank's heart. They were worried about what was happening to their town. "Hank, you've got to help us organize." "We can't let them take the barn," shouted Joe, a fellow farmer whose family had been on this land for decades. In that moment, Hank felt it, a community rising. They gathered at the community center, voices rich with solidarity echoing off the walls. They organized rallies, drew up petitions, and made plans to confront the developers. Hank shared stories of his father teaching him to tend the fields, of his kids running through the barn, making memories that were priceless. The more he shared, the more people felt the same connection, the same fight rising in their hearts. As the rallies grew larger, so did the energy in town. Families brought banners, painted encouraging messages, and celebrated their collective fight against the corporations that sought to erase their history. The barn became a symbol of life and resilience, and Hank's resolve shifted into something much larger than himself. Without realizing it, they all began to fight together. Word spread, and soon every corner of the town was buzzing with stories about Hank and his barn. They filled the local newspaper, sparked discussions on social media, and drew attention from activists beyond their small town. It was beginning to feel like something big, a movement, but the developers were not just willing to roll over. They sent in their attorneys, armed with legal obstacles and endless papers. They lit the fires of fear, arguing in court that this farmland was simply not worth saving. The threats became more pressing. Hank received letters that read like cold, hard steel, warning him of impending eviction, holding back the rent as they pushed harder and harder for his land. One gray morning, after a particularly contentious meeting, Hank sat alone in the barn, the sound of the wind howling outside echoing through the wooden beams like a ghost. Doubt crawled into his mind, gnawing at his determination. Maybe they were right. Maybe he should just take the money and run, spare his family the pain. That's when he heard laughter, his children playing outside, their carefree voices rising like sweet music in the air. They were not burdened by the weight of the world. They lived in joy and freedom. In their laughter, he found his strength again, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. He rose from the shadows of despair to stand proud in the middle of the barn, echoing determination in every corner. It was time to ramp up their campaign. He called a community meeting. This time, it wasn't just about saving the barn. It was about preserving their way of life. They strategized and planned, their collective strength pouring out like a river rushing towards the sea. Hank shared new ideas. They would organize a Save the Barn festival. They'd bring in food vendors, music, and raise funds to hire a lawyer. People rallied, spreading the word like wildflowers in spring. The day of the festival dawned bright and clear, a refreshing counterpoint to the darkness that had threatened to envelop their spirits. Children played, laughter swirled, and the once silent barn came alive with music. Neighbors and visitors from nearby towns poured in, united under the banner of preservation. Hank stood atop a makeshift stage, scanning the crowd with a heart full of gratitude. "Thank you all for being here," he called out, his voice steady. "This barn is more than just a building. It's where we've built our lives. It represents family, community, and our hopes for the future." The applause erupted, a wave of sound crashing against the walls of their beloved barn. Hank could feel the vibrations, the pulse of unity coursing through him. The spirit of the day carried them into the night, with laughter intertwining with resolve, but storms have a way of creeping back. Just as Hank thought they had built enough momentum, the developers retaliated. They filed a lawsuit, aiming to discredit Hank's efforts, painting him as the villainous, stubborn man trying to hold back progress. The news broke headlines, pushing all the fears and contradictions into the light. This time, Hank had to counter not just for himself, but for all those who believed in him. As he studied the legal documents, poring over every intricate word, he felt the weight of his neighbor's hopes sitting heavily on his shoulders. Would they be able to withstand this new onslaught? The court date arrived like a thundercloud, heavy with uncertainty. Hank stood outside the courthouse, heart hammering like a blacksmith's hammer on iron. Faces of friends and neighbors filled the benches, a show of support that wrapped around him like a protective barrier. Hank listened as the lawyer for the developers spoke artfully, using words like inconvenient and obsolete to describe the barn. The counterarguments were dull, cold, but Hank's heart thundered, ready to defend what he held dear. Then it was his turn. He stood before the judge, rooted in defiance. This barn is where my family has grown. It's filled with laughter, love, and hard work from generations. Each word fell like a stone, heavy and resolute, and suddenly the room was alive with energy. He looked out at the family faces in the crowd, the hopeful eyes of his children. This was not just about him, it was about all of them and the future they dreamed of. You can't just come in here and take what doesn't belong to you. The judge watched Hank, his expression betraying nothing. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. They waited, breaths bated, hearts racing. After what felt like an eternity, the gavel came down, breaking the quiet, in favor of Hank Dawson. A wave of relief swept through the crowd. Mothers hugged children, friends embraced one another in joyous disbelief. Hank's heart soared, filled with the warmth of vindication. He had fought like hell, and the community had stood behind him. That evening, with the stars sparkling overhead, they gathered around the barn once more. Lights strung between the beams created a kaleidoscope of dreams. Hank stood in the midst of friends and family, looking up at the structure that had endured the storm of corporate greed. Together, they raised a toast not just to the barn, but to the bonds they forged, the unity they created. They protected more than just a piece of land, they had protected their way of life. And as they celebrated under that resilient roof, Hank Dawson understood something profoundly true. The fight for something meaningful never ends, it evolves, it grows. Each victory and challenge cemented the ties that bound them, and together they would keep doing what they did best. They would fight for their stories, their legacies. As the laughter echoed into the night, he took a deep breath, letting the moment wash over him. The barn stood strong, not just a structure of wood and nails, but a living testament to the power of hope, community, and the unyielding spirit of a farmer who fought with everything he had. The sun hung low in the sky, golden rays spilling across the fields like warm honey. But in the heart of that picture-perfect day, something dark and menacing lurked just beyond the horizon. Hank Dawson stood at the barn door, hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching as three men in crisp suits walked across his yard. Their polished shoes crunched on the gravel, each step a reminder of the storm about to hit. Mr. the tallest of the men called, an overly confident smile stretched across his face. Hank's stomach dropped. He stepped out from the barn's shadow, meeting their gaze with a fierce determination. The man continued, his tone smooth as glass. "Yes, your farm. We're prepared to make you an offer for the land." He held up a glossy brochure depicting shiny new buildings, sprawling parking lots, all set against a blue sky. Hank's heart raced, a surge of anger bubbling at the surface. "Thrive, you mean tear it down for a shopping complex." The air around them became charged, as if the very earth felt the weight of Hank's spirit. He took a deep breath, frustration pushed his voice higher, sharper. "This barn is more than wood and nails. It's where my father taught me to farm, where I raised my kids." The men exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for the fire that Hank projected. "Mr. Dawson," the lead man tried again, "you can't hold on to the past forever." A cold wind swept through the yard, seeming to carry Hank's words away. "Progress. You think bulldozing this land is progress?" With that declaration, he slammed the barn door, the sound reverberating like a cannon, shaking the very ground beneath him. Hank stood still, his heart pounding. He was ready for this fight, whatever it took. The barn behind him wasn't just his past, it was also his present and future, a legacy forged through sweat and tears. Days turned into weeks, weeks into a relentless grind of confrontation and denial. Each time the developers returned, they brought different angles, money, promises, and a veneer of charm that fell flat against Hank's resolve. "Just sign on the dotted line, Mr. Dawson. Your family could use the cash," the lead man would say, but Hank refused. He felt like a cedar tree, deeply rooted, immovable even in the harshest winds. Every evening, he'd gather with neighbors who would arrive at the front porch, their voices intermingling in a chorus of support. Shouted Joe, a fellow farmer, his face lined with worry. The community began to rally, uniting against a common enemy. Stories of losses and ancestral ties echoed through their gatherings. Together, they formed a shield against the encroaching darkness, igniting a fire that not even the fiercest developer could snuff out. Then came the day of the town hall meeting, an event that transformed everything. The small room reverberated with tension as townsfolk packed together, eyes glimmering with purpose. Hank stood at the front, feeling the pulse of a community come alive. Each story he shared spilled from his heart, images of laughter and labor spilling from his past. "This barn isn't just a building," he began, his voice steady yet passionate. "It's a symbol of everything we stand for. It holds the memories of our ancestors." As he spoke, he noticed the nods around him, the grip of hands tightening in solidarity. People began to share their own stories, lives intertwined with the very earth they stood on. The The tide of determination rose, a palpable force that swept through the community. But the developers were not idle. They watched, biding their time, plotting their next move. One evening, Hank received a chilling email. The developers would drag him into court, escalating the fight from verbal sparring to a full-blown legal battle. The storm was ready to unleash its fury. The court date loomed like a thundercloud approaching from the distance, filling Hank with annoying dread. He spent sleepless nights going over legal documents, learning the jargon and machinery of a system that felt like a foreign language. And each night he would return to the barn, standing in the dim light, drawing strength from the shadows of memories. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived, the air thick with anticipation. Hank stood outside the courthouse, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside him. The steps were daunting, but behind him stood a sea of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, family all ready to fight beside him. When the gavel fell, Hank felt a chill run through him, but he remained resolute. He listened as the developer's lawyer painted him as the bad guy, a man refusing necessary progress. "This barn is a relic," the lawyer argued. Hank felt anger bubble up, but he remained calm as he took the stand. Before the judge, he spoke directly, his voice steady. "This barn is not just a structure, it's a lifeline. It holds history, community, and love. It's where real life happens, not a shopping complex." As his words hung in the courtroom, Hank felt the air shift. The people gathered outside were more than spectators. They were his lifeline, the roots of a story that refused to wither. Their spirits fed his resolve, merging with his own, transforming fear into courage. After the hearing, the judge paused to deliberate. The room was tense, the minutes stretching like hours. In favor of Hank Dawson, he finally pronounced, the words breaking the tension like a wave crashing against the shore. Relief washed over Hank, a tide of emotions flooding his heart. Cheers erupted from the crowd, a spontaneous eruption of joy and disbelief. Hank felt the weight lift off his shoulders. They had won this battle. He joined his neighbors, laughter and tears mingling in a joyful swirl of humanity. That evening, as night descended upon the barn, Hank gathered everyone around the old oak tree that stood sentinel nearby. Under a canopy of stars, he spoke from his heart. "This isn't just a victory for me, it's a victory for all of us." As the celebration unfolded, stories were shared and plans were made. They didn't just win a court case, they solidified their bond in a community that had once felt fragile under the weight of external pressures. Hank understood now that every tear shed, every sleepless night spent worrying had forged something stronger than steel hope. The barn stood tall, adorned with lights and laughter. It was a testament not just to a fight fought, but a life lived. Hank watched as kids ran through the fields, chasing dreams under the endless sky, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. But even in victory, Hank knew there would always be challenges. The world was rapidly changing, and he saw other towns struggling as corporate powers tried to swallow up their histories and legacies. "We won this battle," he reminded his neighbors, "but it doesn't end here." Inspired by their victory, the community turned the barn into a hub for discussions, farm markets, and shared resources, the essence of what Hank fought to protect. It became a living symbol of resilience, a gathering place where people came together to support one another. Months passed, and Hank found solace in the everyday rhythms of farm life. The barn was filled with laughter, neighbors exchanged goods, and children played without a care in the world. Yet he resolved that the fight wasn't to be forgotten. Each season reminded him of those brave days filled with solidarity. Then one peaceful evening, as Hank walked through the fields, he felt a familiar chill sweep through the air. In the distance, shiny new vehicles pulled up in front of his barn. Panic surged through his chest as he rushed towards them. But this time, these were not men wearing suits laced with greed. They were townsfolk friends who had come together once more to renew their commitments. As he approached, he heard the unmistakable sound of laughter and camaraderie. There they were, fellow farmers sharing ideas, laughter echoing like a warm embrace. His heart swelled, the future felt bright. Shouted Joe, lifting a glass. "We're starting a community cooperative." Excitement rippled through the crowd. Hank couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked, incredulous. Joe continued, grinning wide. "A way to stay connected, grow together, and educate those who want to learn." It was a realization that struck Hank like lightning. The very space he fought to protect had transformed into something more powerful than he could have imagined. A community hub, a promise for the future, where the barn was alive with purpose beyond just survival. As the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the fields, Hank stood tall amidst his friends, a symbol of hard work, resilience, and community. He felt the weight of love and history binding them together, a promise of a brighter future that surged through their veins. They had fought tooth and nail to keep the barn and their community alive, showcasing the raw, unyielding spirit of togetherness. And in that sacred space, Hank knew they would continue to fight for every dream, every home, and every heartbeat that echoed across the land they cherished. The barn wasn't just the past, it was the future. And together, they would ensure that it remained steadfast, a beacon of hope in a world that often tries to swallow legacies whole. There, in that moment, under an endless sky, they made a vow that would reverberate through the generations to come. They would protect their story, protect their home, and above all, they would stand together against any storm that dared to challenge them again. The sky was a heavy slate gray, and the air crackled with imminent rain. Hank Dawson stood at the edge of his property, the familiar, comforting sight of his barn looming before him, yet a gnawing tension twisted in his gut. Today was going to change everything. 3 men in slick suits had arrived unannounced, striding across his fields like they owned the place. Their expensive shoes crunched on the gravel, loud and intrusive against the quiet backdrop of the farm. Hank's heart raced. He didn't need to be a farmer to know when trouble was brewing. "Mister," the tallest of them called, his tone slick as oil. Hank crossed his arms, squinting against the clouds that rolled like an approaching storm. His voice was deeper than the sky above him. The man stepped closer, his eyes glistening with false friendliness. "We have a proposal for you, a generous offer for your property." Hank's heart dropped as the man waved a brochure in front of him, its colors bright and enticing, illustrating a future that felt more like a nightmare to Hank. Change. The man hesitated, sensing they had underestimated Hank's resolve. Think about the jobs it could create. Hank felt a fire ignite within him, fierce and bright. "Progress? You think it's progress to take this barn from me?" The men exchanged uneasy glances, sensing Hank's defiance. He stood firm, feet planted in the soil that had nurtured generations of his family. This land wasn't just property, it was a lifeline. The lead man sighed, frustration creeping into his voice. "Mister," with that threat hanging in the air, they turned and walked away, but Hank felt an electric surge of determination. The barn wasn't just a building. It held memories, laughter, tears, a living testament to the legacy of the Dawson family. As the sun fought to break through the thick clouds, Hank retreated to the barn, pacing the familiar wooden floors as the walls seemed to whisper words of comfort. He could hear his father's voice, "You stand your ground, son." Days turned into weeks, and the men returned with a barrage of legal threats and relentless pressure. Each time they came, Hank felt the weight of their ambition grinding against his spirit. They rolled out flashy offers and empty pleasantries, but each time Hank stood resolute. Every night he'd sit on the porch, staring out at the fields, remembering the warmth of late summer spent working under the sun. What would his father say if he knew he was even considering their offers? It fired Hank's resolve more than ever. Then came the day of the town meeting, a turning point. The dusty gymnasium was filled with familiar faces, each filled with worry and determination. As Hank stood at the front, he felt the energy shift in the room. "We need to stand together," he urged, his voice rising above the murmurs. "This barn isn't just mine, it's ours. It's a part of our community." People shifted in their chairs, eyes glistening in the fluorescent lights. Old Joe, a retired farmer, stood, his voice trembling with age and anger. "Hank's right, we can't let them do this." The crowd erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. A wave of unity washed over Hank as he felt the bonds of their community tighten around him. They might have come as individuals, but they were leaving as an army, a family prepared to defend its own. Fueled by this newfound spirit, they organized rallies, dotted the landscape like wildflowers in spring. People poured into the town, filling parking lots and streets, united against the looming threat. Hank felt a renewed sense of purpose as the days rolled into a whirlwind of activism. They held events in the barn, potlucks, meetings, social gatherings, all while weaving plans to confront the developers. The barn transformed into a sanctuary, a gathering spot where the community could share stories of laughter and resilience. But the developers were relentless. They fought back with lawsuits, sending a new wave of frustration crashing over Hank and his supporters. Letters arrived threatening legal action, filled with language so cold it felt like a slap across the face. They wanted to wear him down, to tire him out until he would just give in. One stormy evening, after an especially harsh letter arrived, Hank found himself standing in the barn, the thunder rumbling outside like a warning of what was to come. He felt the weight of it all bearing down on him. Doubts whispered in his mind, clawing at his confidence. What if they really could force him out? But then he caught sight of the memories that enveloped him, the faded photographs hanging on the wooden beams, snapshots of laughter, of generations of Dawsons who had poured their souls into this land. He straightened, allowing their strength to permeate his own. The following day, the community gathered once more at the barn. Hank stood before them, his voice steady. "They think we'll back down if they push hard enough, but we won't." The crowd erupted in applause again, spirits soaring with every word Hank spoke. It was a rallying cry, echoing through the rafters of the barn like a battle hymn. Hank realized they weren't just protecting a structure, they were fighting for a vision, a dream for their community. But the fight wasn't over yet. The court date came, a turning point shrouded in tension and uncertainty. Hank stood at the entrance, heart pounding, surrounded by familiar faces. Each person present was a reminder of why he was there, each nod of support fueling the hope within him. As they filed into the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavy, charged with a sense of impending conflict. The developer's lawyer rose to speak, presenting his case with an air of confidence that dripped with condescension. "This barn is a relic holding back development that will benefit the community as a whole." Hank felt fire ignite within him as he took the stand. This was it, the moment where he could speak for the barn, for his ancestors, for every farmer who had ever faced the same onslaught. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady yet commanding. "This barn is not just a structure, it's a lifeline. It holds stories of my family, lessons learned, and the love we built together." The judge listened intently, and Hank's words rang out, piercing through the air, igniting passion in the hearts of those gathered. Hank continued, teeming with life and memories. "We can't allow greed to erase our history in the name of progress." A heavy silence enveloped the room as Hank's voice faded. Even the opposing lawyer looked momentarily stunned. They hadn't expected such fierce resolve from a simple farmer. Moments felt like hours as the judge took time to deliberate, weighing the significance of Hank's words against the cold, slick arguments of the developers. But the air hummed with a sense of hope, and Hank's heart pounded with anticipation. After careful consideration, the judge finally said, "I rule in favor of Hank Dawson." A collective gasp filled the courtroom, and then, like a dam bursting, cheers erupted from the audience. Hank felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him, enveloping him like a warm blanket. He didn't just win the court case, they had defended their culture, their heart and soul. As they stepped outside, families erupted into joy, hugging one another, laughter mixing with tears. Hank looked at the crowd, seeing the unity that had blossomed among them. They were no longer just individuals, they were a force, a tightly woven community rooted in resilience. Under a sky that finally showed signs of clearing, the gathering moved back toward the barn, their spirits buoyed by victory. Hank knew this fight had only solidified their connections, forging bonds of friendship that would only strengthen with time. Standing beneath the familiar roof of that barn, Hank turned to his community. "This is about more than just winning a battle. It's about preserving our future and standing together when threatened. We won today, but we need to remain vigilant." As he spoke, fire danced in their eyes, and the barn, echoing with laughter, reverberated with hope. Food was shared, stories flowed freely, weaving tales of their experience together, a living tapestry of community history. Months rolled by, and the barn transformed into more than just a shelter. It became a communal hub. People held gatherings, family events, and market days, bringing together the best of their craftsmanship, art, and spirit. They nurtured the land, planting seeds of solidarity across generations, ensuring that their legacy would endure. One warm evening, as Hank surveyed the fields bathed in the golden light of dusk, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. The barn was alive, thriving with laughter, love, and life. He pictured his children and future grandchildren growing up here, sharing in the rich legacy he had fought to preserve. Hank Dawson knew in that moment that their community had forged not just a battle won, but a foundation built on integrity and the spirit of togetherness. Together, they would face any challenges that came next because they had learned that standing united makes them formidable in the face of adversity. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, he felt the whispers of his ancestors in the gentle breeze, telling him that they were proud. Proud of the fight for something real, something true, and the promise that as long as they kept coming together, their barn and their community would always be safe. With his heart full and a smile on his face, Hank turned back toward the barn, the comforting storm clouds behind him replaced with a radiant sky. In that moment, he knew they would never lose again, for they were no longer just farmers. They were protectors of a legacy woven from love, strength, and unbreakable bonds. And that, he thought, as laughter and chatter faded into the night, was worth fighting for now and forever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow across the fields as dark clouds rolled in like a warning. Hank Dawson stood at the entrance of his barn, arms crossed tightly against his chest, watching three suited men stride toward him with purpose. Their shoes crunched on the gravel, a sharp sound that broke the quiet of the evening. Hank felt his heart race. He sensed that this wasn't just an ordinary day on the farm. "Mister," the tallest of the men called out, a slick grin plastered on his face. Hank straightened, his resolve hardening. "My property." The man stepped forward, confidence radiating from him like an electric charge. "We're offering you a generous sum for your land. It's time to let go of the past and embrace progress." A shopping center could bring jobs, prosperity. Hank cut him off, their words igniting a fire within him. "You mean bulldoze my barn, my family's history?" The man's expression flickered momentarily, realizing that maybe they had underestimated the man standing in front of them, a farmer who had poured his soul into that land. "Mr. Dawson, you need to think long-term. This is a chance to cash in and leave a legacy," the man pressed, the warmth of his voice dripping with insincerity. Hank shook his head, a mixture of anger and disbelief bubbling within him. "You think a shopping complex can replace the memories in this barn?" The laughs, the hard work, the dreams. The man's smile faltered and he gestured to his companions. "We'll be back, Mr. Dawson." As they turned and walked away, Hank slammed the barn door behind him. The sound echoed, a booming reminder that he was ready to fight for himself, for his family, and for the generations that had come before him. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted like dark clouds heavy with rain. The men returned again, their tactics shifting from offers of cash to threats cloaked in professional jargon. Hank were serious. Hank felt the weight of their intimidation tactics push against his spirit. But as each day passed, he drew strength from the barn that stood steadfast behind him. He spent his mornings tending to the land, and every evening he'd reflect on the years spent building this life. He could almost hear his father's voice whispering wisdom into his heart. "You stand your ground, son." One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves turned golden and the air grew cool, Hank gathered neighbors in the barn. The wooden structure smelled of hay and history, a place where dreams had been born. As they stood together, glancing at one another, Hank felt like a tide was beginning to shift. "You all know what is at stake," he said, his voice steady. "This barn is a part of our community. If we let them take it, what comes next?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Old Joe, a fellow farmer, stepped forward, his face lined with years of experience. "They won't stop at just your barn, Hank." Those words resonated, igniting a fire in Hank's heart. They began to strategize, plotting a path toward unity. They organized rallies, holding signs filled with determination. Each rally swelled in numbers, filled with voices drawn together, fueled by the injustice they all felt. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just Hank's alone, it was everybody's battle. The barn transformed from merely a shelter for tractors and hay to a fortress for community spirit. It echoed with laughter during potlucks, and the walls absorbed stories of generations past. Yet the developers didn't back down. Their lawyers arrived, polished and intimidating, ready for war. They sent Hank a series of letters filled with threats, each one colder than the last. "We will pursue eminent domain if you refuse to cooperate," they warned. That night, the storm finally broke. Thunder roared and rain lashed the barn's roof. Hank found himself rooted inside, poring over the letters, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across the pages. Doubt crept into his mind like a thief in the night, gnawing at him. He questioned whether this fight was worth it, whether he could withstand the pressure. But a flash of lightning illuminated the barn, reminding him of the warmth it held, the laughter of his children, the stories shared over family dinners, the dreams nurtured under that roof. Those memories pushed him to rise with new determination. As the storm subsided, he made a decision. The community meeting would not just be a plea for help, it would be a declaration of their intent to stand together. The following week, parents, teachers, and children gathered around the barn once more, the energy in the air electric. Hank stood before them, feeling their collective hope rise like a chorus. He shouted, his voice swelling with passion. "It's a symbol of everything we stand for." The crowd erupted in cheers, the atmosphere charged with unity. Families rallied, echoing Hank's sentiments. They shared their personal stories of loss, of memories tied to the barn and the fields that surrounded them. Old women spoke of summers spent under the barn's roof, children of weddings held on the very land they fought to keep, and young adults shared their visions for a future where this barn remained a hub for growth. The barn became the pulse of their community, a heartbeat they were unwilling to let fade. As the rain washed away the remnants of doubt, a plan began to form. They rallied with petitions, created social media pages, and reached out to journalists. Hank learned the power of community organizing, bartering tools of courage he had never wielded before. Days blurred into nights and the momentum surged. They coordinated protests, invited the media, and generated buzz that rippled beyond their town. Hank felt the tide shift. They were becoming a force unyielding and fierce. Yet even as hope surged, the developers unleashed their final assault. They filed a lawsuit to discredit Hank publicly, casting shadows on his character. They painted him as a stubborn man unwilling to sell for the good of the community. Their goals were clear: to fracture the unity they had built. Hank's heart sank as he sat in his kitchen one evening, poring over the negative headlines. He felt the pressure of their campaign pressing down on him like a heavy fog. This was more than personal, it was existential, but a glimmer of warmth from the barn beckoned him back. He took a deep breath and headed outside. Standing beneath the worn beams of the structure, he closed his eyes and imagined the laughter of his children, futures forged in the shared moments in this very space. Their spirits and courage filled him anew. The courtroom date approached, and the stakes had never felt higher. Good and evil clashed, and Hank knew that the odds were stacked against him. As he entered the courtroom, he was flanked by his supporters, friends, and neighbors who had stood by him from the very beginning. The opposing lawyer rose to his feet, dressed in an expensive suit with an aura of arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple, Mr." But Hank wasn't about to let them dismiss his fight. When it was his turn to speak, he rose with resolve, every breath filled with purpose. "Your Honor, this isn't just about property. This barn has been a cornerstone of my family for generations. It's where my father raised me, where I have raised my own children." The crowd in the courtroom leaned forward, sensing the raw emotion in Hank's voice. "This barn has weathered storms, and it has filled our hearts with warmth. It holds the history of our community, the laughter, the heartache, and all the stories in between." Silence wrapped around him, heavy and palpable. The judge watched carefully, weighing Hank's words. After what felt like an eternity, he turned to Hank and spoke. "I understand your sentiment as a community." As the judge laid out the intricacies of the case, Hank felt a heavy weight settle in his stomach once more. What if they lost? But as the deliberation drew on, the tide turned. Hank's testimony rippled through the room, igniting passion in the hearts of those who heard it. The judge returned with a verdict in favor of Mr. Dawson. Cheers erupted from the crowd, shaking the very foundation of the courtroom. Hank felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over him as joy swept through the room like wildfire. They had fought back against the tide, and they had won. Outside, a radiant sun shone down, breaking through the clouds that once darkened their hopes. Hank embraced his friends, laughter ringing through the air as tears of joy flowed. He had not just won a legal battle, they had preserved something far greater, a community bound by history, hope, and resilience. In the days that followed, the barn transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. It was no longer just a place for storage, it pulsed with life. Families gathered, events took place, dreams were shared, and a new legacy began to grow. Hank stood in the barn one evening, looking around at the joyful faces of neighbors, friends, and family. He realized that the fight hadn't just saved the structure, it had resurrected a community that had learned to stand together, stronger than before. Each weekend was now filled with laughter, music, and stories shared under the very roof they had fought to keep alive. The barn became not just a landmark, but a living testament to the unbreakable spirit of a community that refused to back down. A sanctuary representing all that was meaningful: family, history, resilience. Time passed, seasons changed, and the barn continued to thrive, rooted in love and determination. Hank watched as his children grew, running through fields, laughing freely, their futures secure beneath the barn that had withstood not just storms of nature, but the storms of greed and ambition. And as hushed whispers floated on the breeze, saying he was a farmer who fought like hell, Hank understood in his bones that this battle transcended just the barn. It was a lesson in community, in standing together, and in the bravery it takes to fight for what truly matters. In the end, they had protected more than just a barn. They had nourished the spirit of a generations-old legacy, one filled with love, laughter, and the unyielding belief that together, they could withstand any storm that came their way. The sunlight poured over the fields, casting warm golden hues on the spring blooms. It was an ordinary day in the small town of Maplewood, but for Hank Dawson, everything was about to change. Standing at the entrance of his weathered barn, he watched as three men in sleek suits approached, their expressions too serious for comfort. Their polished shoes crunched the gravel, each step ringing like a warning bell in Hank's mind. "Mister." The tallest of the men called out, a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes plastered on his face. Hank squared his shoulders, instinctively feeling that this wasn't just a casual conversation. "My property," the man stepped closer, the sunlight glinting off his glasses. "We're prepared to make you an offer, an attractive one." Hank's heart raced. "Attractive? You mean you want to bulldoze my barn and my land for some shiny new development?" The man's expression remained unreadable, but the tension in his body told Hank everything he needed to know. "Think about the future, Mr. Dawson. A shopping center here could bring jobs, revenue, and progress to this town." Hank spat, his voice rising, fed by indignation. "You call tearing down years of memories progress? This barn is where my father taught me everything." The men exchanged glances, their confidence fading like the daylight. Hank was not backing down, and they could see it in the fire in his eyes. "Mr. Dawson will be back," the lead man said, his voice colder than before, a warning laced with thinly veiled threats. As they turned and walked away, Hank's heart thudded with a mix of fear and determination. He slammed the barn door behind him, the echo reverberating like thunder. Days crammed into weeks, and the developers showed no signs of letting up. The tension built like the storm clouds gathering above the wide-open fields. Hank received letters filled with legal jargon, threats lurking behind each line. Conversations around town shifted to hushed whispers about Hank's stubbornness. One evening, after a particularly harsh letter had arrived, Hank sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the shreds of his dreams. Doubts wormed their way into his mind. Maybe he was fighting a losing battle, but as he glanced out the window, he caught sight of the barn, the very heartbeat of his family history. It stood tall against the darkening sky, the glow of the setting sun bathing it in an ethereal light. He rose, stepping outside, the cool breeze wrapping around him like a reassuring hug. He wandered toward the barn, placing a hand on the splintered wood. Memories flooded back, his father teaching him how to fix the roof, laughter shared with family during harvest festivals, the barn being a safe haven during winter storms. This was more than wood and nails, it was a legacy. Gathering neighbors in the barn felt like an act of faith as they huddled together, comforted by the familiar surroundings. Hank felt a surge of courage that night, a fire igniting deep within him. "We have to stand together," he addressed them, his voice powerful and unyielding. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd, the energy shifting. Old Joe, a worn yet spirited farmer, stepped forward. "Hank's right, this is about all of us." From that night on, the barn transformed into a fortress of community strength, became the symbols of their struggle. Each event drew larger crowds, each gathering a reminder that the heart of Maplewood beat within those wooden walls. As hope surged, so did the developers' aggression. They sent in lawyers, slick and intimidating, armed with legal threats designed to intimidate. Letters of eminent domain arrived, each one colder and more ruthless than the last. Hank felt the weight of their intimidation pressing down on him, and for just a moment the embrace of doubt crept back in. Then one bleak evening the weather matched his mood. Raging winds howled outside, rattling the barn's walls as Hank pored over the letters. It felt as if the storm was reflecting the tumult inside him. Would he be able to keep fighting? Uncertainty gnawed at his spirit, threatening to unravel the strength he had built. But he stood up, driven by the memory of his father's words, and headed to the barn. He flung the doors open wide, and as the wind swept in, it carried with it the scent of the earth, and that familiar warmth surged through him. He couldn't let go. He would fight, and he would win, not only for himself, but for every person who believed in the strength of their community. The next town hall meeting transformed into a turning point. The gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy, packed with locals eager to voice their concerns. Hank stood at the front, fueled by the energy swirling around the room. "This barn isn't just mine," he declared, his voice rising above the murmur. "It's a home for our memories, our stories, and our future." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants mixing into a rising tide of defiance. Hank could feel the spirit of the community wrap around him, family farms, legacy, and love woven tightly together. Families stood side by side, and a renewed strength surged through him. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore, but the developers wouldn't concede so easily. They pushed back harder, orchestrating a smear campaign that turned neighbors against each other. Rumors flew, whispers of Hank being in it for himself, desperate attempts to fracture the community they had built. One evening, as shadows crept across the barn, Hank stood alone, grappling with the weight of these accusations. He felt the sting of betrayal in his heart. How had it come to this? Just then, the sound of laughter broke through his thoughts. He peeked outside to see children running, playing games in the fading light, their joy insistent and infectious. He realized then that this was about them, not just the barn, but the lives that carried forward its legacy. He gathered his courage and called a meeting, appealing to the hearts of his neighbors once more. "They want to tear us apart, but look at those kids. They deserve to grow up here in a place rich with history." His words sparked a fire in the community. They began to see each other not as adversaries, but as allies united in a common cause. Old Joe pulled Hank aside, a twinkle in his eye. "Son, this barn stands strong because of the people standing around it." The next court date loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Tension thickened the air as Hank walked into the courthouse, surrounded by friends and neighbors. As he entered the courtroom, the atmosphere felt electric, charged with anticipation. The opposing lawyer was sharp and ruthless. "We're here today to address Mr. Dawson's refusal to acknowledge the realities of progress," he began, his tone icy. Hank felt a dull ache in his chest as he listened to the familiar sharpness of the opposing lawyer's words. Then it was his turn to stand. He took a deep breath, grounding himself in the moment, and faced the judge. "Your Honor, this isn't just about a barn, it's about history, it's about community." As he spoke, a flood of emotion washed over him. "This barn has seen love, loss, laughter, and dreams. It has been a refuge for my family and for this community." When he finished speaking, he felt the weight of his words linger in the air, creating a connection with the audience around him. The judge's eyes softened, but before he could say anything, Hank's heart sank as he saw the opposing lawyer's smirk. "The truth is, Mr. Dawson," the lawyer blurted out, "it doesn't matter how much sentiment you throw in front of us." The words cut deep, but Hank stood firm. He wouldn't let fear or doubt steal the fight within him. As he left the courtroom, the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than before, and he could hear the whispers of others, the sharp edges of doubt creeping into the back of his mind once again. The days dragged on like molasses. Hank spent sleepless nights poring over legal documents, trying to understand the murky depths of property law. Anxiety knotted in his stomach. He could feel the tension simmering in every corner of his house, invading his dreams. But then something unexpected happened. News articles began to emerge, highlighting their community's struggle and the historical significance of barns like Hank's. Local support swelled as people rallied around the cause, not just in Maplewood, but from neighboring towns as well. Out of nowhere, hope revived. It wrapped around Hank like a warm blanket. Suddenly, people were showing up at his barn, sharing stories and joining forces in ways he had never imagined. There was power in their pursuit, a sense of unity that began to brew. Finally, the day of the grand community rally arrived. The sun was shining, the sky clear. Families poured into the fields, bringing signs, banners, and an abundance of spirit. The barn's doors opened wide, inviting everyone in. Hank stood at the front, filled with mixed emotions. As he gazed out over the crowd, heart racing, he took a moment to absorb the wave of support. He felt the warmth wash over him as voices chimed together, forming a harmonious occurrence filled with determination. Resonated throughout the air, echoing like a battle cry. Moments turned into hours, but Hank's spirit soared higher with each passing moment. He spoke passionately, drawing strength from everyone present. "This barn represents our unity. It symbolizes the history we share." The night wrapped around them, laughter and chatter mingling as people shared their stories, experiences, and dreams. But just when it felt like they had reached a turning point, dark clouds rolled back in literally and metaphorically. As the rally began to wind down, Hank received an urgent text. A knot formed in his stomach as he hurried over, the weight of uncertainty hanging in the air. When he arrived, he was met with serious faces, fear looming like a shadow. The the town council had received a new proposal from the developers, an ultimatum. The developers wanted to expedite their plans, threatening to move forward with machines if Hank didn't agree to sell by the end of the week. They intended to demolish the barn before the dawn of a new month, ripping the heart out of Maplewood and its legacy. Hank's heart raced as confusion mingled with fear. Time was running out, and his community's future felt more fragile than ever. The ultimatum echoed in his mind, a desperate call for action. Just as hope felt like it could slip away, he met the gaze of his neighbors, their eyes burning with unity. They were ready to fight, and Hank knew he couldn't let them down. This isn't the end. We will not go quietly. Adrenaline surged through him as they gathered to strategize. The town was in peril, but so was their spirit. Together, they wouldn't let their fight be taken from them. Hank felt the courage build within him, a powerful reminder that no matter what came next, they were united and every second counted. But time was their enemy, and as they faced the clock, dread pulled at their hearts. Each minute felt like a hammer pounding in Hank's chest, reminding him of what was at stake. He clenched his fists, steeling himself for the battle ahead. The hourglass was tipped, the future was uncertain. In the hushed tones of urgency, surrounded by his friends, he realized that the fight wasn't just for the barn anymore, it was for the very soul of their community. The time to act was now, and the real battle was about to begin. As the clock ticked down, Hank braced himself for everything that was about to unfold, knowing that this fight would require every ounce of strength, courage, and unity they had left. The stage was set for a showdown that could change everything, and deep down, Hank knew that failure was not an option.